After the demiurge captures some of his mother's light and made it in the atom of light that shined down from the light Aeon Sophia wisdom and imprisoned it in a flesh suit, vaguely glanced over in Genesis 1:3. This is expanded on the Gnostic, the atom of light.
The creation of humankind. Before Atom of Light withdrew into the chaos, the authorities saw him. They laughed at the chief creator because he lied, saying, "I am God, and there's no other God but me." When they came to him, they said, "Is this not the God who ruined our work?" He answered and said, "Yes, but if you wish that..."
Right off the bat, they know by trapping this light in a body, at the end of their 6,000 years, they might go tremble. This light atom is going to come and ruin their work. They know this and they were scared of this.
He not be able to ruin our work. Come, let us create a human being from the earth according to the image of our body and according to the likeness of his being to serve us, so that whenever this being sees his likeness, he may become enamored to it. Then,
Genesis 1, the light got trapped in the flesh. Now they're going into Genesis 27. They're creating a being that when they look at that being, they would think the being is their own, but the being had a counterfeit spirit in it. It makes it abundantly clear in the Bible when it goes through that there was a new being made. There was a being made that was called man, and then there was another being made that's called Ish and the Ishar. And the text made it abundantly clear that that is not a man. Man is the number 120, and then the Ish and the Ishar was created. I'm going to get you the receipts.
and he will no longer ruin our work, but shall make those who are born from the light our servants through all the time of this age.
Hello, I said they trapped the light and then they created a mechanism to make the light their servant until the end of the age. They know it's not forever. We're going to wake up and we're going to start kicking them in the teeth with this knowledge.
Now all this came to pass according to the forethought of Pistis, in order that humankind might appear after this likeness and condemn them on account of their fashioned bodies, and their fashioned bodies become fences for the light. Then the authorities received knowledge necessary to...
Their fashioned bodies became fences for the light. I believe I said to you in the last video, this light being that they trapped, they were melanated being. This dark skin that I have is to protect me, is to cover my light from Sakla, Yaldabat. Because he is a blind God. The only way he could see us is when our lights start to shine up. All right?
create people. Sophia Zoe, who was with Sabaoth, anticipated them and laughed at their decision because they were blind and ignorant. They created him against themselves. They do not know what they do. Because of this, she anticipated them. She created her human being first in order that he might tell their fashioned body how to scorn them and thus to escape him. Now the birth of instructor occurred in this way. When Sophia let a drop of light fall, it floated on the water.
The instructor, now we're in a prison of darkness. This is the Kali Yuga cycle. I question anyone's intelligence who think they could find holiness within the freaking Kali Yuga cycle, knowing that the Kali Yuga cycle is an age of counterfeit and deceit. All right? Peep what's going on here. Peep what's going on here.
That he might tell their fashioned body how to scorn them and thus to escape him. Now the birth of instructor occurred in this way. When Sophia let a drop of light.
That's what I stopped this to talk about. The instructor. Imagine you're in a dark prison ruled by a dark lord. Who is it that you're going to hate the most? The freaking light. You are so dark and ignorant, you curse the light. The instructor that came to break you out is who you call the serpent in Genesis. That's the instructor, according to the Gnostics. That is the light that we curse. I got to go into the Melchizedek order, into the New Testament of this light inside of us that we curse because we're in a dark mental jail. a jail without walls, a jail that's governed by morals and dogma, which, of course, at the end of the 6,000-year epoch, is coming apart at the seams. Watch this.
Fall, it floated on the water. Immediately a human being appeared, being androgynous. She molded that drop first as a female body. Afterward, she molded it with the body in the likeness of the mother who was conceived, whom the Greeks called Hermaphrodite, while the Jews call this mother Eve of life, that is, the instructor of life. Her child is the creature who is Lord. Afterward, the authorities called in the beast in order to lead their fashioned bodies astray. The meaning of the beast is the instructor.
Wow. The more you go over this, the more you catch the pros. They told you that after that, they called the instructor the beast in order to lead the light that they captured astray. Let me ask you a question. Question 101. And this is how I think by rubbing my temple. What did they call the serpent in the Bible? The smartest beast that God had made. I love it when one text just answered the other one so perfectly. I wasn't even going for this.
For it was found to be wiser than all beings. Now these things were revealed by the will of Sabaoth and his Christ to the souls who will come to the fashioned bodies of the authorities. Concerning these the Holy Voice said, multiply and flourish to rule over all the creatures. And these are the ones who are taken captive by the chief creator according to their destinies. Wow. And thus they were locked into.
Here is what they glanced over when they said the light shined down. The first Adam, the Adam of light, when he shined down, what happened preceding that, up to where I start the video? The demiurge was going around beating his chest. I am God, there is no God above me. I am God. And he had his children, the beings of this solar system, right? And he's going around beating his chest. I am God and there is no God above me. If there is a God above me, show your goddamn self. At that moment, Sophia, they glanced over that light that shone upon the water. At that moment, Sophia stretched out her hands, that picture that you see, Michelangelo, the two finger pointing down, and shine her light on the water. That again complements early in Genesis 1, where it says the earth was void and darkness, and then the Spirit of God hovers upon the face of the water. This again complements that part of the document.
The prison of the fashioned bodies until the consummation of the age.
Until the
cosmic ruler mold Adam. At that time, the chief creator then expressed his opinion about humankind to those who were with him. Then each of them cast his seed into the midst of the navel of the earth. Since that day, the 7 rulers have formed humankind with his body like their body, but his likeness is like the human appeared to them. His fashion.
Again, when they said, let's make man in our own image, that part, there's a lot of question there. The occult document says, they fashion their beings based on the image that hovered upon the water that Sophia shined down, the Adam of light.
Body came into being one part at a time, and their chief created the brain and the nervous system. Afterward, the person appeared like the one before him. He became a person with soul, and he was called Adam, that is, Father, after the name of the one who was before him. Now after Adam was made, he left him as a lifeless.
Hopefully, we're going to get to the part into this where it literally says the 3 Adams. So you have an Adam of light, you have an Adam of flesh, a fleshly Adam, and then you had something else that was created. It's like a complete demon. We're going to get to that.
Vessel, since he had taken form like an aborted fetus with no spirit in him. Regarding this, when the chief ruler remembered the word of Pistis, he was afraid that a true human might come into his fashioned body and rule over it. Because of this, he left his fashioned body 40 days without soul, and he withdrew and left him. But on the 40th day, Sophia Zoe sent her breath into Adam, who was without soul. He began to move upon the earth, but he could not stand.
So attaching with all of the myth, this primordial deity even though she was a light deity and she was dealing with creatures of physicalness. And I didn't go into explain how these beasts got created, but I want to get into that right now. That's a whole different thing. She still had a part in the Gnostic text says when the demiurge left, she came back and put something in the being, which is called an illumin epinoia. That equals out to your imagination. And while your teacher may say, oh, that's just your imagination, and downplay your imagination is a big part of how you're going to break out of these chains. So when the demiurge created this being and he was like lifeless, Sophia came back and put something else into him, which even the demiurge didn't have. And then she's going to trick the demiurge now to turn around and blow in his mouth. Therefore, the little light that he stole from his mother, which he took and he lorded over the other archons, he's now going to blow that into the atom unknowingly. This guy's a retard. This guy's not God.
And up. Now when the 7 rulers came and saw him, they were very much disturbed. They walked up to him and seized him, and the chief ruler said to the breath within him, "Who are you, and from where have you come?"
Turn that down.
It answered and said, "I came through the power of the human for the destruction of your work." When they heard, they glorified him because he gave them rest from their fear and concern. Then they called that day the day of rest, because they rested themselves from their troubles. And when they saw that Adam could not stand up,
oh my gosh. That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion. Oh my God, I'm just freaking losing my religion in all this documents here. Because here again, it brings about a different meaning of why they brought about the Sabbath. I'm not even going to go too much into that. I got to glide over it.
they rejoiced. They took him and left him in paradise and withdrew up to their heaven. Eve gives Adam life. After the day of rest, Sophia sent Zoe, her daughter, who was called Eve, as an instructor to raise up Adam, in whom there was no soul, so that those whom he would produce might become vessels of the light. When Eve saw her male partner cast down, she pitied him, and she said, "Adam, live, rise up on the earth." Immediately her word became an accomplished deed. For when Adam rose up, immediately he opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, "You will be called the mother of the living, because you are the one who gave me life." The cosmic rulers rape the earthly Eve. Then the authorities were informed that their fashioned body was alive and had risen, and they were very much disturbed. They sent 7 archangels to see what happened. They came to Adam, and they saw Eve speaking with him. They said to one another, "What is this enlightened woman? For truly she resembles a likeness that appeared to us in the light. Now come, let us seize her and cast our seed into her, so that when she is polluted she will not be able to ascend to her light, but those whom she bear will."
Let us seize her and cast our seed into her. Within this level of the research, in your document, in your Bible, Eve says, "I have gotten a man from the Lord." Pretty much saying that Cain wasn't. As a matter of fact, some of them go as far as to saying both Cain and Abel was from the demiurge and the archons. Right here is telling you they cast their seed into her.
Serve us. But let us not tell Adam, because he is not from us. Rather, let us bring a stupor upon him, and suggest to him in his sleep that she came into being from his rib, so that the woman may serve and he may rule over her.
Boy.
Then Eve, since she existed as a power, laughed at their false intention. She darkened their eyes and secretly left her likeness there with Adam. She entered the tree of knowledge and remained there. They pursued her, and she revealed to them that she had entered the tree and had become the tree. And when the blind ones fell into a great fear, they ran away. Afterward, when they sobered up from the stupor, they came to Adam, and when they saw the likeness of that woman with her, they were troubled, thinking that this was the true Eve. And then they acted recklessly, and came to her and seized her and cast their seed upon her. They did it deceitfully, defiling her not only naturally, but also abdominally, first defiling the seal of her voice, which had spoke with them, saying, What is that exists before you? They meant to defile those who might say at the consummation of the age that they had been born of the true human by means of the Word. And they were deceived.
This is a sidebar. Look at this. Who was Lilith? First wife of Adam. So then this text happened to be talking about Zoe right now, who was sent to Adam to raise him up. But of course, in the age of Kali Yuga, counterfeit and deceit, they lie about everything. Everything out of their mouth is a lie. I'm not going to get into the myth of Lilith, but in the soundbite, Lilith was supposed to be the first woman that was created with Adam. When Adam wanted to get on top of her, she says, I am made from the same source as you, so she wouldn't go into a submissive position and she'd fly away. How much sense does that make? These liars.
Not knowing that they had defiled their own body. It was a likeness that the authorities and their angels defiled in every way. Eve bears the children of the cosmic power. First Eve conceived Abel from the first ruler, and she bore the rest of the sons from the seven authorities and their angels. Now all this came to pass according to the forethought of the chief creator, so that the first mother might bear within herself every seed, mixed and joined together with the fate of the world and its configuration and justice. A plan came into being because of Eve, so that the fashioned bodies of the authorities might become fences for the light. The first atom of light is spiritual and appeared on the first day. Might bear within herself every seed.
Now we're getting to the meat of
the
things.
Fate of the world and its configuration. And
again, don't take my words, dude. I could be a liar undercover, trying to bring forth some stuff and make myself look good. The world is full of that. Listen to what the documents is saying. 3 separate atoms. Okay? We're going to tie that into the root races.
And justice. A plan came into being because of Eve, so that the fashioned bodies of the authorities might become fences for the light. Then the light will condemn them through their fashioned bodies. The first atom of light is spiritual and appeared on the first day. The second atom,
Genesis 1:3,
was a person with soul and appeared on the 6th day.
When did they create this freaking demon? On the 6th day. On the 6th day. It made it abundantly clear in Genesis 1:27. The numbers are H119, H120, H121, and it tells you to compare it to H7854. Would tell you that shit was Satan. That shit was the adversary that was meant to rule over us for 6,000 years. Let them talk, and I need to shut up.
Called Aphrodite. The third Adam is earthly, that is, a man of law who appeared on the 8th day after the rest of poverty, which is called Sunday. Now the progeny of the earthly Adam multiplied and was completed and produced within itself.
The earthly Adam is multiplying. We're going to get into this earthly Adam. Number one, we know that he is a white person. There's no racist involved here, or no racial tropes involved here. This is what the document says. He is made to be blush, a reddish man. When you go through this, you can't help but laugh.
All the technical skill of the Adam with soul, but all were in ignorance.
They then made a red Satan in Genesis 1:27, under the Hebrew words number hacker H119, red man H120. H121, the text asks the reader to compare it to H7854, which means Satan, the adversary, who was made to rule over the children of light, now imprisoned in a flesh suit. There is no racism involved here. The text made it abundantly clear that what was made was a white man that was made to blush, a red devil. I challenge you to go into blueletterbible.org and put in the H19, H1120, H121, and compare H7854, and tell me if I'm reading this correct. What do you think about this cutting-edge research? Jump in the comments and tell me if I'm reading this correctly. If you find this level of research beneficial, please like, share, and subscribe. After they created their atom of flesh, a white man that was made to blush, a red devil, Satan, who was to be our adversary and ruler for 6,000 years. Then after the demiurge and his archons had sex with Eve and got Cain and Abel, we see in that Cain was an outright leper. Genesis 4:7. Why has your countenance fallen? If you doeth well, will you not be accepted? H763 from H5375, an elevation or leper scab. Then we moved down to Noah, who was said to be a full-scale albino Dundis. Unlike Hesiod, who taught about the 4 root races, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and how after the golden race, now misnomered as black people, each root race after that declined in degradation until we came to the Iron Man creation, who was the weakest, the most evil, and the perfect reflection of the Kali Yuga cycle. We then came across the Neanderthal leprosy sheik from Uarkal. Abraham lived in the same vicinity where Yahweh Enlil had their lab, experimenting on how to create the perfect red devil, a place called Eden. We see this Satan, according to Genesis 1:27, coming into ancient Kemet, Egypt as a sheik over a large leprosy army, who was actually one of the leprosy enemy Hyksos pharaohs, Sheshi Mamebra, aka Abraham, of the 14 dynasty, who kicked off the Shepherd King's invasions in the beginning of the Aries Age of North Egypt, Lower Egypt, namely Avaris Goshen. What an entire race of liars! Yakdim Sekhanre, or Yakubam, would be Jacob, who the low-life liars told us he went to Egypt like some old peasant. Didn't even bother to tell us the inconvenient truth, that this Jacob was a piece of shit Neanderthal, leprosy Hyksos invaders that played a huge part in the destruction of our people globally. Ralph Ellis made an entire career out of just researching this one particular tutelage of knowledge and has become a master in the field. While speaking about the usurper, the supplanter, Jacob Akafero Yakbim Sekhanre, the name stealers, just like their Khazarian descendant, what a quinky dink. One can't help but to think about that Nation of Islam well-ridiculed myth of the Yaqub, the big-headed scientist who created the white race to rule. While the Satans of Genesis 1:27 loves to ridicule this myth, it is extremely difficult to ignore the running parallels with the theme of the invading Asiatic Hyksos leprosy invasion of Afaraka, Africa. There are too many parallels with the usurper / the supplanter Jacob, aka Pharaoh Yakum Sekhenre, or Yakubam, who lead a new subnation of Neanderthal leprosy people, and the OSARSEPH, aka Akhenaten, aka Moses, who led a nation army of leper out of Egypt, just like the big-headed scientist Yaqub, who made a nation of devils and was kicked out in order to purify their lands. Now that we have found the Menetho and Josephus records of the leprosy outbreak in Egypt and why they had to kick out these leper, a people stricken with a disease of evil in order to cleanse their lands. Now that we have all the corresponding records to the Nation of Islam, myth of Yaqub, the big-headed scientist, your awkward ridicule to cover your shame has backfired. And look who is laughing now. You have used your satanic Genesis 1:27 Neanderthal leprosy religion to enslave the world. Now the Aquarian age is having none of your deceits and lies, as it comes in with an abundance of knowledge. The same thing why sweet nanny goat, now a run him belly. The following is an article I came across on academia.com called OSARSEPH and Exodus, Literary Reflections in an Egyptian Mirror, a paper presented by Gary Greenberg at the annual meeting of the International Society of Biblical Literature, Lausanne, Switzerland, 1997. Do listen as Mr. Gary Greenberg, as he explained in his paper. Of course, Mr. Greenberg would know what really happened as one of those pervert the truth to cover their shame and sell the masses this 1 ton of hog shit of Neanderthal leprosy, chosen bullshit. Busted. OSARSEPH and Exodus, Literary Reflections in an Egyptian Mirror, paper presented by Gary Greenberg at the annual meeting of the International Society of Biblical Literature, Lausanne, Switzerland, 1997 abstract. The story of OSARSEPH, preserved by Josephus and attributed by him to an Egyptian priest named Manetho, tells of the struggles between a rebellious Egyptian priest named OSARSEPH and a pharaoh Amenhotep and his son, Rameses, also called Sethos. OSARSEPH, according to the story, seized control of Egypt for 13 years, instituted a reign of terror, and destroyed Egypt's religious institutions. The pharaoh fled from Egypt and hid his son away for safety. Later, the son returned and expelled OSARSEPH from Egypt. This OSARSEPH, says Manetho, was Moses, the biblical hero. Most Egyptologists and biblical scholars who study this report easily recognize that it tells of events during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, but they uniformly reject the identification of Moses with OSARSEPH. By concentrating solely on the passage identifying these two figures as one and the same, however, I submit that scholars have overlooked many additional passages that have literary parallels in the biblical Exodus account, but which switch the role of villain and hero. In this paper, I will look at some of these parallel events and show that Manetho's story of OSARSEPH and the Bible's story of Moses and the Exodus draw upon many of the same Egyptian literary themes. Among the issues examined are the hiding of the infant from the cruel ruler, the return of the infant later on to challenge the cruel ruler, the seeing of God, leprosy, and the city where the slaves worked. The paper will argue that the Exodus occurred during the co-regency of Ramesses I and Sethos, and that the confrontation between Moses OSARSEPH and Ramesses, also known as Sethos, arose out of a struggle for possession of the throne at the death of Pharaoh Horemheb. The Manetho and biblical stories each represent an attempt to identify the hero with the god Horus and the villain with the god Set.
Therefore, Apian slandered the temple in Jerusalem, stating that in its shrine, the Holy of Holies, it had set up a head of a donkey and worshipped that animal. In fact, this tradition of associating the Judeans with the worship of a donkey is quite widespread and found in 7 different ancient sources, such as Messias, Diodorus, Apian, Plutarch, Tacitus, and Democritus. Apian claims that this statue was revealed when Antiochus IV Epiphanes plundered the Jewish temple in 167 BC and discovered this statue of a donkey. Nonetheless, Apian states that when Antiochus IV Epiphanes plundered the Jewish temple, he found in its shrine, the Holy of Holies, the statue of a donkey. The problem is, and this is where Josephus gets personal, Apian has the mind of an ass and the imprudence of a dog. For besides this story, Apian also included Menesses' story of a golden ass head from the 2nd century BC. The story goes that during a war between the Jews and the Idumeans, inhabitant of an Idumean city called Dorai, who worshipped Apollo and was called Zabidus, came to the Jews and promised to deliver into their hands the god Apollo. Zabidus arrayed himself in an outfit which made him look like stars travelling upon the earth, and the Judean people believed it was Apollo and remained at a distance, stunned, as he simply walked into the sanctuary and snatched away the golden head of the ass. The point of the story is not so much the donkey worship of the Jews, but the gullibility of the Jews and the theft of this idol in the temple, which provided the final victory of the Idumeans. But the question is, however, where exactly does this claim of a statue of a donkey in the Jerusalem temple originate? Well, one interesting theory put forward by Bar, Kokhfer and others is that its roots lie in the Egyptian association of the ass with the god Seth, named Typhon by the Greeks. This god was associated by the Egyptians with their enemies and invaders, as Bar Kokhba writes. The old Egyptian deity Seth gradually acquired the character of the devil, the bad deity, the source of all evils and misfortunes besetting the Egyptians and their gods. The lists of the disasters brought about by Seth includes darkness, mass deaths, diseases and storms. He was also regarded as the god of the wilderness and nomads, of foreign countries and of alien residents in Egypt, especially Semites, and was explicitly identified with Baal and other foreign deities. It was therefore only natural for the Egyptians, who were at least annually reminded by their Jewish neighbours about the stories of the Exodus, to identify the Jews' god, or Moses, with Seth. These associations with Seth were reinforced by Manetho, who described the city of Avaris, the former capital of the Hyksos, as from earliest times Typhonian. And the archaeology at Avaris has confirmed that the main temple and deity was Seth, and that he was also identified by the Semitic people with the Canaanite storm god Baal. Moreover, even after the expulsion of the Hyksos, the temple of Seth remained in continuous use, as James Hoffmeyer writes. The excavations at Tel El Dabar in recent years show that the so-called expulsion of the Hyksos by King Ahmose at the outset of the 18th dynasty did not result in the obliteration of the city, although tombs were plundered. While the site for the most part seems to have been abandoned, the Seth temple continued to be in use throughout the 18th dynasty until major renovations were initiated under Hornheb. Since the Seth temple was permitted to function on some basis, it appears that there must have been a sufficient number of possibly Asiatic devotees. Therefore, given the Egyptian association between the Jews, the Hyksos and the city of Avaris, as well as the mysteries surrounding the contents of the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, interestingly, this carried over into Christianity, as there has been found a piece of Roman graffiti from around 200 AD scratched on the wall of a room near the Palatine Hill in Rome, which depicts a young man worshipping a crucified, donkey-headed figure with a Greek inscription which states Alexmos worships his god, indicating that it was apparently meant to mock a Christian named Alexmos. This graffiti would point to the foolishness of someone that would both worship the Jewish donkey-headed god that is then, even worse, embodied in the utterly shameful, crucified person of Jesus.
The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in his Against Apion, records a story about an Egyptian priest named OSARSEPH, who leads a revolution against a pharaoh named Amenephis, takes control of Egypt for 13 years, commits horrendous religious abuses, and is eventually driven out of Egypt by the pharaoh and his son. Josephus attributed the story to a 3rd century BC Egyptian priest named Manetho, who had written a history of his native country. Most scholars familiar with this story have easily recognized that the OSARSEPH story provides a disguised account of the events surrounding Pharaoh Akhenaten and his monotheistic religious revolution. What makes this story controversial, though, is that, according to Josephus, Manetho said that OSARSEPH was Moses, and that his followers were a collection of diseased Egyptians. Josephus also quotes a second Egyptian historian named Chaeremon, a contemporary of his, who tells of the same set of events, but with enough variations in the story to suggest that he relied on a source different than Manetho's. Chaeremon, too, identifies the rebel leader with Moses, but gives him the Egyptian name of Tisathan. However, he also says that Moses had a core revolutionary leader named Petaseph, and identifies this Petaseph with Joseph, an identification possibly based on the similar pronunciation of the two names. Almost all biblical scholars and Egyptologists reject the idea of a connection between Moses and Akhenaten, and the two Egyptian stories are simply dismissed as false. Since the portions of the story identifying Moses with OSARSEPH or Tisathan consist of a single sentence easily removable from the larger account, many scholars have suggested that The insertion resulted from either a forged addition to the original Manetho or a hateful anti-Jewish slur. Others have suggested that Manetho relied on a source from Egyptian records, but that the source was erroneous. The concentration of attack on this one reference, I believe, prevented scholars from stepping back and looking at the two stories as a whole and comparing them to the biblical account of the Exodus. In this paper, I want to examine both stories and show that together they present the same storyline as the biblical account of the Exodus, and that both the biblical and Egyptian stories utilize a common Egyptian literary motif, which draws upon the OSARSEPH and Exodus SBL N97 Gary Greenberg. 2. Egyptian political myths concerning the struggles of Horus and Set for the Egyptian throne. I also suggest that the Egyptian and biblical stories are describing the same set of political events from a different political point of view. Let me begin with a summary of the two stories. The Manetho story. The main players in the Manetho story are the pharaoh Amenophis, his son Sethos, also known as Ramesses, and OSARSEPH, a priest from the city of Heliopolis, known as On in the Bible. Amenophis is the Greek transliteration for Amenhotep, the original throne name of both Akhenaten and his father. According to Josephus, Amenophis had a desire to see the gods, and he communicated this desire to a famous seer. The wise man told Amenophis that he could accomplish his goals if he purged Egypt of all the lepers and polluted people. Delighted with this news, the king rounded up all such people, to the number of about 80,000, among whom were several priests afflicted with leprosy. But strangely, instead of having them leave Egypt, he enslaved them in the stone quarries, segregating them from the rest of the Egyptians. When the seer learned what Amenophis had done, he feared that the pharaoh's actions would bring a violent retaliation from the gods, and predicted that the polluted people would join with allies, and they would take control of Egypt for 13 years. As a side note, one should recall that Moses, too, desired to see God, and his actions also seem to have had some connection to leprosy and disease. In the one instance, after asking to see God directly, his face changed in such a way that it frightened the people, and he had to wear a veil, a form of cover identified in Leviticus 13:45 with leprosy. In the other instance, in the presence of the burning bush, the hand of Moses turned leprous. After a long period of misery, the slaves petitioned the king, asking permission to move to the abandoned city of Avaris, the former capital of the Hyksos kings. There they laid plans for a revolt and elected OSARSEPH, a Heliopolitan priest, to be their leader. His first orders were not to worship the Egyptians' gods and to kill off the sacred animals held in reverence by the Egyptians. He then fortified the walls of Avaris and prepared for war against Amenophis. Next, he sent an ambassador to the exiled Hyksos leaders and formed a military alliance. The Hyksos sent 200,000 soldiers to join with OSARSEPH's people. When Amenophis learned of the coming invasion, he remembered the seer's prediction that Egypt would suffer for 13 years at the hands of its enemies. He arranged protection for the sacred animals and icons, and then hid his 5-year-old son, Sethos, also called Ramesses, with a friend. And I note parenthetically that Sethos, also called Ramesses, is the name that Josephus uses for the pharaoh's son. After making these security arrangements, Amenophis assembled an army of 300,000 of Egypt's finest soldiers and marched against the OSARSEPH Hyksos alliance. But at the last moment, he had a sudden fear that his actions would be construed as an attack on the gods, and rather than engage the enemy, he pulled back his troops and withdrew to Memphis. There he gathered the sacred animals and withdrew his forces to Ethiopia, where the king gave him land and protection. OSARSEPH ruled the land for 13 years, instituting a reign of terror. He burned cities, mutilated sacred images, killed the sacred animals, and had his followers eat the sacred beasts. At some point during OSARSEPH's reign, according to Josephus, the usurper changed his name to Moses. At the end of the prophesied time period, Amenophis and his son, now confusingly named Ramses, that is, with a letter P inserted into the middle of his name, advanced from Ethiopia with a large army and drove the enemy deep into Syria, killing many of them along the way. And so the story concludes. Karaman's version. The Karaman version of this story contains some interesting variations. He also refers to the pharaoh as Amenophis, but identifies the son only as Rameses, omitting the Sethos portion of the child's name. In Karaman, however, there are two rebel leaders, one named Petaseph, whom he identifies as Joseph, the Hebrew patriarch, and the other named Tisathen, whom he identifies as Moses. In the beginning of this story, Amenophis does not desire to see the gods. Instead, he had a vision in his sleep of the goddess Isis, who reproached him for the destruction of her temple during a war. Worried by his dream, Amenophis seeks advice, and a sacred scribe tells him that if he purges Egypt of the contaminated people, he would no longer have to be alarmed. The king rounded up 250,000 such people and ordered them out of the country. Tisathen and Petaseph led the polluted ones to the Egyptian border, but when they got there, they found an exiled Egyptian army of 380,000 soldiers belonging to Pharaoh Amenophis. The two forces joined together and marched against the pharaoh. Not to put too fine a point on this, but Karaman's claim here is that Moses was aided by an army belonging to Akhenaten. Here too, Amenophis fled to Ethiopia, but in this account he left behind his pregnant wife, who hid in a cave and gave birth to the child Ramesses. At some undefined time in the future, when Ramesses has achieved manhood, he drove the Jews from Egypt into Syria. Jews is the word used by Josephus, and brought his father home from Ethiopia. The two stories compared. It is quite apparent that both stories are about the same set of events, but the differences between them suggest more than one source for the account. In Manetho, Amenophis desires to see the gods. In Karaman, he has a vision of deity. In both stories, though, in response to the pharaoh's concern, a seer advises him to round up the lepers and polluted ones and banish them from Egypt. In Manetho, Amenophis disobeys the advice and gathers the polluted ones together in the stone quarries. In Karaman, Amenophis takes the advice and banishes them. In both stories, the polluted ones rebel against the pharaoh. But, in Manetho, they send for an ally with the Hyksos. In Karaman, they meet an exiled Egyptian army and join with them. In Manetho, there are 80,000 rebels and 200,000 Hyksos allies. In Karaman, there are 250,000 rebels and 380,000 Egyptian allies. In Manetho, the child is 5 years old when his father flees Egypt, at which time the youth is hidden with a friend. The child is 18 years old when he returns and drives OSARSEPH out. In Karaman, Rameses is an infant at the beginning of the rebellion and born in secret, hidden away by his mother. He returns as an adult of unspecified age at the time of his victory. Biblical comparisons. Let us now compare the OSARSEPH Petaseph rebellions with the biblical account of the Exodus. Plot-wise, the Egyptian story has the following structure. 1. A pharaoh fears that a large group of people living in Egypt represent a threat to the throne. 2. He vacillates between letting them leave the country and enslaving them. 3. He also vacillates between confronting them militarily and retreating. 4. He orders them enslaved. 5. After a period of enslavement, they ask permission to journey to another location of special interest to them. 6. A god is to punish the Egyptians for the pharaoh's act of enslavement. 7. The slaves rise up against the pharaoh and bring great devastation to the land. 8. A cruel ruler comes to the throne and oppresses the people. 9. A child is hidden away from the cruel ruler. OSARSEPH and Exodus SBL 97, Gary Greenberg. 10. The child is raised in the pharaoh's household. 11. When the child reaches adulthood, he liberates his people from oppression. 12. The former slaves are chased out of Egypt by the pharaoh. With just one slight plot twist, this storyline is almost identical to that of the biblical Exodus. In the Egyptian account, the child liberator is the future pharaoh, and the cruel tyrant is the slave leader. Therefore, in the Egyptian story, the child is hidden away after the slave revolt, while in the biblical story, the child is hidden away before the slave revolt. In most other respects, however, the biblical and Egyptian stories are virtually identical. In both accounts, the pharaoh fears a particular group of Egyptian residents. He enslaves the people whom he fears. The slaves are isolated from the rest of the country. The slaves initially ask to go only to a different location, The pharaoh vacillates between a hard line and retreat. A god punishes Egypt for the act of enslavement. The slave leader causes great devastation to befall Egypt, and the slaves are chased out of Egypt by the pharaoh. There are also some interesting factual coincidences in the Egyptian and biblical accounts. The most significant concerns the city of Avaris. In the Bible, the Hebrew slaves are assigned to the city of Ramses, which scholars generally equate with the Egyptian city of Pi-Ramesses. This Egyptian city received that name during the reign of Ramesses II. But the original city name was Avaris. So in both the Egyptian and biblical accounts, the slaves are identified with the same city. Interestingly, neither Josephus nor Manetho seem to be aware of this coincidence. In the Manetho account, the slaves number about 80,000. In the Book of Numbers, the Joseph tribes total about 85,000 members. In the Charamon account, the combined forces of OSARSEPH's army number 630,000 soldiers. Compare that with the claim in Exodus 12:37-38 of the Exodus group consisting of 600,000 males plus a mixed multitude. There is also the matter of Heliopolis. That city has a close religious link to Pharaoh Akhenaten, who worshipped Re-Herakti, the chief deity of that city. Biblical Israel also has a close religious link to Heliopolis because Joseph, upon becoming prime minister of Egypt, married the daughter of Heliopolis's chief priest. Horus and Set. The several plot parallels and factual coincidences in the Egyptian and biblical stories suggest a common literary source, but there is still this difficult matter of the role reversal between the pharaoh and the slave leader. To explain this anomaly, we must first examine the chief political myth of Egyptian life. According to the Egyptians, the god Osiris and his wife Isis ruled over Egypt in a golden age. Osiris and Isis were brother and sister, as well as husband and wife. They also had a brother named Set and a son named Horus. Set wanted to be king, so he assassinated Osiris and seized the throne. But the infant Horus was the legitimate heir, and Isis, fearful that Set would kill her son, hid him away for safety. When Horus grew to adulthood, he returned to avenge his father. Defeating Set in battle, he assumed the throne and banished Set to the desert wilderness. In the Egyptian mind, all legitimate kings represent the god Horus in a human aspect. This myth is ancient. Its basic structure, possibly derived from events surrounding the unification of Egypt at the Pi, beginning of the first dynasty by Horus worshippers. In the second dynasty, political conflict between Horus and Set worshippers again reappears, with at least one king adopting the name Set instead of Horus, and another adopting the combined name of Horus and Set. And between the 12th and 18th dynasties, when the Asian Hyksos kings dominated Egypt, the Hyksos chose Set as their chief deity, while the rebellious native Egyptian royal line continued to identify with Horus. OSARSEPH and Exodus, SBL and 97 Gary Greenberg. 5. The political events defining Horus and Set also overlapped in the area of nature mythology, with Set on the one hand being identified with the evil serpent that devoured the sun at the end of each day, and on the other as the mighty warrior that defended the sun against the evil serpent. Despite the murder of Osiris, a Set cult remained active in Egypt, and the deity retained a relatively positive image down into the 19th dynasty. As late as the post-Exodus 20th dynasty, we find an Egyptian story known as the Contendings of Horus and Set, in which Horus and Set sue each other for the right to rule Egypt, with Re-Herakti, king of the gods, favoring Set over Horus. The favorable image of Set in New Kingdom times can be seen from the fact that two 19th dynasty pharaohs were named Sethos after him, and Ramesses I and Ramesses II closely identified with the city of Avaris, which had been dedicated to Set. With the expulsion of the Hyksos kings, myth and history combined to form a literary iconography, one that is reflected in both the OSARSEPH and Exodus stories. Set is the cruel usurper who is subsequently driven into the wilderness. Isis is the mother who hides her child from the cruel ruler. Horus is the child who returns as an adult to defeat the usurper and regain the throne. Amenophis and Sethos. The Bible indicates that the pharaoh confronted by Moses had just taken the throne, but it does not identify the pharaoh or his predecessor. In the OSARSEPH story, the pharaoh who confronted the Moses character was named Sethos, also called Ramesses. I suggest that the name Sethos, also called Ramesses, is a confused description of the very brief coregency between Ramesses I and his son's successor Sethos I. This identification is somewhat problematic, though, because the father is identified as Amenephis, who is either Akhenaten or Akhenaten's father. Akhenaten came to the throne 59 years before Sethos I, and several other pharaohs ruled in between. But if we look at Josephus's somewhat confused rendition of what is represented as Manetho's 18th dynasty chronology, with several pharaohs out of chronological sequence, we find the unusual sequence of Ramesses I, Amenephis, and Sethos I, with Sethos I being identified as Sethos, also called Ramesses. The Amenephis in that sequence, placed in the middle of the coregency between Ramesses I and Sethos II, is obviously Akhenaten, because he is given a reign of 19 years, the combined length of reign for Akhenaten and his coregent. Strangely, Josephus totally ignores this chronological sequence, alleging that the Amenephis in his story is a fictitious king invented by Manetho, the literary model for Exodus. If I am correct in placing OSARSEPH's rebellion during the coregency of Ramesses I and Sethos I, then we can place both the OSARSEPH story and the biblical Exodus story within the literary and political framework of the struggle between Horus and Set. Ramesses I was the successor to Horemheb. Like Horemheb, he served originally as a general in the army and had no royal blood. His total reign lasted about 2 years, part as coregent with Horemheb and part as coregent with wine. The Bible makes Moses an adopted member of the royal household. If the pharaoh of confrontation is either Ramesses I or Sethos I, Moses would have had an arguable claim to the Egyptian throne. He was a member of the preceding royal house, and neither Ramesses I nor Sethos I had any royal blood ties. The confrontation between Moses and the pharaoh, then, was a confrontation over the right of succession to the royal throne, Moses claiming a tie to the royal bloodline and Ramesses, also called Sethos, claiming the legitimate right of succession. Such a conflict would certainly generate an intense propaganda war for the support of the powers that be. OSARSEPH and Exodus SBL I-97 Gary Greenberg, 6. Each side attempted to identify itself with Horus and the challenger with Set. Consequently, each side is identified with the royal child hidden by his mother from a cruel oppressor, and the challenger is depicted as the illegal usurper. At the same time, the literary model is placed against a background of actual political events growing out of the religious political feuds between Pharaoh Akhenaten and the Theban establishment. At first, Akhenaten brought about a hated religious heresy. When he died, a counter-revolution occurred. Under Pharaoh Horemheb, an intense political persecution of Akhenaten's followers took place. When Horemheb died, OSARSEPH Moses returned to Egypt, led his oppressed followers in rebellion, and challenged Horemheb's successor for the right to rule. Civil war loomed in the background. OSARSEPH Moses lost the political contest and left Egypt with his followers. Each of the disputants depicted the exodus of OSARSEPH as a victory over the rival, claiming to have caused great damage to the enemy forces. For a parallel, one might think of Ramesses II falsely boasting about how he single-handedly drove the Hittites into the Orontes and drowned the enemy. Consistent with the Egyptian desire to suppress all public record of Akhenaten's existence, no monument recorded the pharaoh's victory over his political rival. But non-public versions of the story survived in Egyptian records. Scribes in both camps framed the historical events within Egyptian literary formats and produced parallel accounts, each portraying their own hero as child liberator and depicting their rival as the usurping villain. Like backward writing, if we hold both texts up to an Egyptian literary mirror, we can see the true history reflected back at us.